Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of the Deep Cover Podcast. This weekend, or really last weekend before it as well, the college football season kicked off again. And it's a time of great excitement for football fans across the United States. And that's mostly because I think college football has become the second most popular sport in the NFL, or in the country after the NFL. I think that it is more popular than the NBA, and I think it's more popular, of course, than baseball and hockey and soccer are. So people get excited about it, right? They get fired up about rooting for their teams, and I always found rooting for teams in college football is always interesting because typically you have like two subsets of fans. You have the ones who root for teams that are always in contention, and then you have the ones that root for teams that are kind of middling to really bad. And the first set of fans expect their team to go 13 and 0 every single year, win the conference championship, and end up in the college football playoff. The rest are hoping for 7, 8 wins. If you go to a bowl game and you upset one of the big dogs along the way, and that is, in that sense, a successful season, right? And the college football ecosystem and dynamic has changed a lot over the last decade. And even more so if you go all the way back to the 1990s when it was AP poll picking the actual national champion without having a national championship game. But as things have changed, I've started to wonder, what is the end game of college football? In the sense of, what is this all working towards? What are we looking at for the future of this sport? And the reason I say that is because over the last few years, we've seen players start to get paid, players being able to move around without a problem. We've seen a lot of shuffling of schools. We've seen conferences dissolving. We've seen more and more money being injected into the sport. All the while, we've also seen a lot of the funding for other sports kind of take a back seat because they're so focused on football. So today, I want to talk about college football, where it's headed, when is enough enough, and are we ever really going to see it continue to progress the way it's been progressing? So let's dive right in. First thing is, this year is the first year of the expanded 12-team playoff. And I think this was long overdue. You talk to anybody who's been watching the game for a while, the fact that they were relying on the BCS championships model before was kind of ridiculous, especially when the one AA or FCS model has been doing a 16 team playoff for a number of years without any problems. And those schools have less funding, less elite athletes, and yet it didn't get in the way. But the NCAA would always say, well, amateurism and it's, the strain of adding these extra games. These aren't NFL players and so on and so forth. The reality is the sponsorship money from the Bulls was too high, right? So whenever they wanted to make a new playoff format, it always had to incorporate the Bulls in it. And that's what they've done with the 14 playoff that has been in play for the last decade. And I think it's been mostly successful with the 14 playoff. You do have a team every year that is excluded that feels like they should have been included. And in that sense, you could look at the NCAA basketball March Madness tournament and the 68 teams that make it in because of the first round play in, that 69th team is always feeling slighted that they believe they should have gotten in over another team, right? It's just the exclusionary nature of picking teams for a tournament, right? But now we've gone to 12, which I think is a good thing because it gives those teams from the power conferences like the SEC, like the Big Ten, who maybe lost in the conference championship game, a chance to still play in the playoff, right? But it also gives the group of five, the non-big schools, a chance for somebody to get in and to play for a title. So you get big dogs, you get teams that are really good, and then you get the Cinderella story. So there's a little bit of everything. But what I wonder here is 12 ever going to be enough? And right now we have about, I think, 120 to 130 uh, schools in the NC1A tier, the FBS tier as it used to be called. Do we see it eventually go to 16 and eliminate the bye week for the top four seeds? Do we eventually see it go to 32? I highly doubt we'd ever see it go to 64, but 32 feels not that far off. And the reason I say that is because at the end of the day, the NCAA and college football, and really sports in general, functions off of the capitalism model of getting more and more people to watch, which increases ad revenue, advertisements, placements, which increases the capability to sell a new slate of packages to a network so they could pay more money to these schools, and that in turn increases NIL funding for the players as well. So we're at 12 now. I think we're going to be at 12 for a few years. I believe within the next decade it's going to go to 16. And I think in the decade after that, we could see it go to 32. Because if you really think on it, the four big conferences right now are the SEC, the Big Ten, the Big 12, and the ACC. You could argue that there are probably 4 to 5 worthy teams from each of those conferences on a given year that are worthy of at least attempting to play for a national championship. If you looked at last year's records, for example, from the Big Ten, now I'm including the Pac 12 schools in here, even though they were in a different conference last year. But you had Michigan, who ended up winning the whole thing, Oregon, Ohio State, Washington, four big time teams, and Penn State was ranked throughout the year. So that's 5 schools that you could say are worthy of playing for a national championship. You look at the SEC, you have Alabama, you have Georgia, a lot of times Tennessee, Ole Miss. You'll have enough schools to put in there. So if between those four conferences, if you have 5 schools, that's 20 teams, and that allows the 32 team model would allow for 12 teams from a mix of the group of five and the kind of on the bubble type of teams in the bigger conferences to compete for a title. Now, if you do 32, that is going to be, potentially a bunch more games for a college athlete. So that's going to be something they're going to have to reckon with. But I think we would all be well within our logic here to understand that the NCAA ultimately doesn't really care about the athlete. What the NCAA and college football as a whole dynamic cares about is revenue and accrued from the sport, right? So if they can make a case for 32 down the road, I think that's going to happen. I think 16 is a sweet spot because it keeps it at the elite level. Because when you get to 32, you start talking about teams that will be ranked outside of the top 25, making it into the playoffs, and then it becomes maybe a little watered down. You see a lot of 6 and 7 teams, maybe even a 5 and 7 team get in, and then it makes it a little bit diluted. So I think 16 is probably where they're going to go to, but I wouldn't expect the playoff expansion to stop anytime soon here. Now, let's shift a little bit here. We talked a little bit already about NIL, but I want to talk about the name, image, likeness, and the transfer portal here. The landscape of college football, really college sports in general, but I think football and to a lesser degree basketball have it more than others, is that now that players can get paid through NIL, there's no guardrails, right? There is, it's basically the wild, wild west. And as long as you have money to pay a player, you can go ahead and do it. Nick Saban recently on College Game Day talked about, you could spend $20 million a year on players, but you got to make sure you get the right players or else you're going to be out of a job. And I think that's why guys like him have exited the game because they don't really want to deal with name, image, likeness, and player contracts and stuff. And, in that sense, it kind of speaks to the benefit of a broken system that guys like Saban took advantage of, and now the players are getting paid and compensated. He doesn't want any part of it, which that's obviously his prerogative. But the transfer portal has kind of created this free agency, and in college, and there's over 2,000 players who transferred just this past year across all schools, and that's a lot of movement and activity And I think for as great as it is for freedom of movement and being able to maximize your opportunity in college, you also have a situation where players maybe leave too quickly and they went from being a top five recruit at their position to transferring three, four times, and now they're not even on the NFL's radar, when it comes time to graduate. So it's created this kind of whirlwind of a situation in college where every player is kind of like a 1 year rental at this point, right? And you're seeing coaches, who aren't adapting to it kind of suffering. Clemson is really the biggest example of this. Clemson was, for a number of years, with Dabo Swinney, one of the powers in college football. They went to multiple national championships, won some, and they had great players. They had Deshaun Watson, Trevor Lawrence, who have come through. Who have both gone on to pretty successful NFL careers, and they they just did not want to, or have not shown a desire to want to do anything to do with the transfer portal. Dabo says, "I got my guys are good enough." Well, what happened? Went into Atlanta this past weekend, ran into a buzzsaw in Georgia, and got blown out. And they continue to fall behind the Florida States and the Miamis even to compete in the ACC, let alone nationally, because they just refuse to engage in the transfer portal, and it's only through recruiting. And that shows a lack of vision on Dabo's part, but it also shows what you have to do to win today in college football. You have to recruit well, first of all. You have to have a solid foundation to make the player want to stay. And then you have to convince the player to want to stay and not enter the transfer portal. But at the same time, you also have to be active in the transfer portal to make sure you're bringing the best players on. So it's this delicate balance that we're seeing here. And it reminds me a lot of how NFL teams have to manage their rosters, where you're kind of in the NFL, you're gauging price and value with age. In college, it's really just about talent. How can I get this talent in? How much money do I have to offer this talent? And how can I balance the talent, right? And there's a scumminess factor to all of this with college coaches because they'll go into talk to seven different running backs and say, "Hey, I'm going to make you this and I'm going to get you to the NFL." But, there's only so many snaps and so many times that player could get on the field. So that's where the transfer stuff happens like crazy, right? And it's become just incredibly chaotic in the sense of it's a year by year thing. You look at the University of Washington, they graduated a lot of players, they had a few players transfer out. 10 of their players from last year's national championship team went on to the NFL. They retained only two starters on both sides of the ball total from last year. So they have a whole new team. They were active in the portal, new coach, Judd Fish. He was active in the portal, brought in a bunch of players from SEC and Big 12 schools, and it's been a total rework. But it's not the rebuild that we used to see because, again, there's such a desire for these teams to compete right away. What in the case of Washington, they're in a new conference. They're in the Big 12, Big 10 this year. They got to play Michigan. They got to play Penn State. In addition to already having to play USC, Oregon, and UCLA. So there's a pressure to compete and be good right away because there's a lot of money here that's involved. Speaking of conferences, I want to talk a little bit about the size of conferences. I think it's funny that we still have conferences named the Big 10 and the Big 12 because these conferences do not have that many teams in them anymore. The Big Ten is now a national conference, right? It's coast to coast. With the addition of the four Pac-12 teams, you now have 18 teams in the Big Ten. The Big 12 is continuing to add teams. SEC is continuing to add teams. ACC is the only one who's kind of been left out here, so I'm curious to see what they do. But what is the limit to the size of a conference in the college football landscape? Is it 20? Is it 30? And I think it leads to this thought that we are barreling ahead towards the whole super conference idea, right? And I think what you're going to be left with is the Big Ten and SEC are both going to have 30, 32 teams. And in the concept of a 16-team playoff, each conference will send eight, and and then they'll compete for the national championship. And it almost feels like an AFC, NFC, Eastern, Western Conference sort of a vibe. And I just wonder, we've lost a little bit of the regionality of college football. So what I mean by that is that in the past, you used to have the Pac-12, for example, was very decidedly regional, right? In the sense that all the schools kind of recruited guys from California and Arizona and Vegas and stuff. They all had a style that felt very West Coast. You know, the coaches were West Coast. Everything was West Coast vibes, right? And then you juxtapose that with the SEC. It was again, they're recruiting a lot of guys from Louisiana, Florida, Texas. You know, it was very, it felt very Southern. The coaches were usually Southern. You know, it was kind of like an imprint and a reflection of the area that they played in. You know, and again, in basketball in the Big East, you saw that a lot of New York kids who went to like St. John's or Villanova, right? You know, it's just kind of a very regional feel. But now the conferences are national, right? The Big Ten stretches from Seattle and LA all the way to Piscataway, New Jersey and Maryland, right? It's coast to coast. And they're not the only one. The Big 12 has added Utah, and they also have Cincinnati, right? The SEC has stretched into Texas and Oklahoma, and I wouldn't be surprised to see them stretch even further out west once more conferences kind of start dissolving here, right? And it's just it doesn't feel that same kind of one of the magic elements of college football feels to be taken away because of all this expansion. And you wonder how much is too much, right? Do we get to a point where we have a 60 team conference, right? And you just kind of like start to kind of ponder aloud like, all right, where is the next amount of poaching coming from? Is the Big 10, if they want to continue to expand to say 24 teams, are they looking at the Big 12, and then in turn the Big 12 looks to grab from the Mountain West or the Sun Belt or Conference USA? How long does this continue to happen? And I think as long as they can tap unreached markets, like here's an example: the University of Memphis, right, is obviously it has a foothold there in Tennessee. If you're the Big Ten and you want to compete with the SEC in that market, in the Tennessee market, why wouldn't you go after a Memphis, right? Since the SEC already has Tennessee. Conversely, let's say Toledo all of a sudden becomes like a reputable team that's must see television. Does the SEC go after that because that allows them to tap into the Ohio and Detroit markets where they have Michigan, Michigan State, and Ohio State already, right? You know, where does it end? And what is the real end goal here with these conferences? Is it just to get a maximum TV footprint, or is it to actually create a competitive conference to beat the other conference? And that kind of leads me to the overall scale of college football. It's incredibly nationalized now, right? In the sense that they're on all the big networks. The coaches are getting big deals. The players are making money. How much higher can it go, right? And that's kind of something I wonder about. Like, does the NIL money just continue to grow? Like we saw recent reports of Oklahoma State using a QR code to crowdsource and crowdfund a um, donation pool for their NIL fund. I wouldn't be surprised to see more and more teams do that, trying to kind of get more and more money from the fan, in addition to getting more money from the boosters. And like it's become a thing where it feels like money is what dictates who's successful, who isn't successful, more than it ever has before. You know, before you could say, "Oh, this person's a good recruiter," or their scheme is great. Like Chip Kelly in the early days of Oregon, it was that case, right? You know, they were getting good but not great players and still competing on a national level. Now it's really how are you going to buy the players? And you know, there's something that's a little corporatized about that feels a little bit of the magic is gone from the sport, right? But at the same time, you do like to see the players getting paid because they're the ones risking their bodies on the field. So I just wonder, without any guardrails, it just feels like it's going to get more and more unruly and untamed. And I was recently watching the Connor Stallions documentary on Netflix, and if you don't know, he was the guy who was doing the sign stealing for Michigan. They threw him under the bus, and he was banned by the NCAA for a few years from having a college job. He coaches in the Detroit area at the high school level now. So when you are watching this doc, though, you see how fervent and dedicated this guy was to the University of Michigan. And he is kind of a microcosm of the fandom in college football. It is incredibly rabid. So the pressure is maximized, ratcheted up to 10, because there's a lot of money being thrown in and they want to see their school succeed. Back in the 80s, when SMU was illegally paying players, this is before obviously NIL was legal, you would see people say, hey, the people who were like high level business people who went to a certain university wanted to have bragging rights over their colleagues who went to a different university, right? So if you graduated from Georgia, maybe you want to see them do well. You want them to invest more and more money so they continue to be racking up SEC titles in addition to national championship appearances. And that scale has kind of led to a new phenomenon, I think, which is the GM concept. Alabama has a GM, right? You may not know that, but they just re signed their GM. And what this person does, they are solely responsible for talent acquisition, recruits, paying the recruits, and knowing how to divvy up the funds that Alabama has available to it. And the same thing in the transfer portal. I think that's going to become more and more common. And the line between NFL and college, in the sense of what separates a pro from a non pro, is becoming more and more invisible. And that's because college football is basically pro football with lower salaries, right? And more teams. And the college football world has been a feeder league into the NFL for many years. So, players getting paid a bit before they go to that next level makes a lot of sense. But you do wonder, is after a certain point when the conferences get so big, do conferences implement a sort of salary cap? Is it where this is how much you can spend on players? Because right now, if you're a smaller school, and you're in one of these bigger conferences, let's use Indiana as an example. Indiana isn't going to generate the revenue and isn't going to generate the funding that Ohio State or Michigan will, right? So they're already kind of behind the eight ball, unless you could get like all these local players in the general area to really want to commit and play for Indiana football. But they're always going to be kind of behind the eight ball. And I just kind of wonder, are we going to see a situation where that cap is implemented to promote more parity, right? And I think more than any other sport in the U.S., college football has the least parity, right? And you could always say you could win on any given Saturday and all that, but at the end of the day, there's a handful of schools that typically always do well. Michigan, Ohio State, Georgia, Alabama, LSU, Texas and Oklahoma are always in the mix, it seems like, right? So those schools are going to have the funding. It's no secret that that's part of the reason that they're so successful. And I just wonder if we see that, plus if we see a dynamic where NFL teams license out, the dynamics of college to kind of increase their revenues, right? So, like if you're the Tennessee Titans, do you partner and license out the University of Tennessee? Right, you use their stadium, you use their image and likeness, but you're the one who's paying the players, right? And you're the one who's doing that. And they become your kind of feeder league in that sense, right? You could see that, like, use Indiana example with the Colts or, Rutgers with the Giants or Jets, that sort of thing. And, it just gets you to wonder, like, the line between pro and college has become so minimized. Where do we even make a distinction? Is it just in the sense that you have a marching band and a bunch of student section? Is that really the only difference? Because right now the players are paid, the coaches are paid big money. There's free agency. Only thing you're really missing is trades. And I often wonder. are they just going to fully lean in to the professional nature that their game has become? And I feel like we're maybe not that far off. Conversely, well, how would we maybe decide what schools would be elevated into the top ranks and what schools are in the lesser glamorous conferences? Like, could we perhaps be seeing the beginnings of like a promotion and relegation system in the sense of, okay, Northwestern, you're the worst team in the Big Ten. You get bounced into the MAC next season, and hey, Toledo, you won the MAC, you're going to be in there the next season. Or, with the Big 12, you could operate that within Conference USA. You could also do that with the SEC and the Sun Belt, and then ACC with the Mountain West. Whatever the case may be. And is that on the horizon? Because at that point, even if you don't win in the playoff, you could say, hey, MAC school, Sun Belt school, Conference USA school, you have a chance to really jump up to the big dogs and get access to more funding, right? And a lot of this stuff maybe seems a little bit outlandish, but I think we're not too far away from these being conversations that actually happen. And I think the biggest issue to really tackle with here is just how disadvantaged football has made other programs in the college system, mainly because of the conference realignment, right? And like if you were at Stanford, and you were used to going to UCLA and USC and Oregon State, Washington State, all up and down the West Coast to play your games, and you're in like softball or baseball, that was great. It's regional. You play multiple times a week, so its travel wasn't a huge deal because they're all relatively close in the context of the U.S. But now you're in the ACC. You may be playing Cal one week, but then the next week got to go to Raleigh, North Carolina. And then maybe come back. You gotta, go and have a home game in Stanford, and then go back again. Again, now you gotta go to Tallahassee, Florida. It just is not very tenable, and a lot of these decisions are being made with football only in mind. And I think what you're going to start to see is a push to separate football from the NCAA entirely. Or you're going to see more and more schools just say, we cannot afford to be involved in football. Or they say, all we can afford is football. Let's cut these other sports, right? We saw it a lot during the Olympics. A lot of people who were like swimmers, track and field, they were talking about the lack of funding when it comes to the colleges and stuff. And that's because football makes the money. It is going to get the lion's share of funding. It's going to get the lion's share of revenue. It's going to get the lion's share of NIL. And that is the sad reality of college sports in 2024. And I don't have sympathy for universities. I find that they're going to give any reason not to pay their athletes what they should be paying them in relation to the revenue that they're generating through TV deals and contracts. Like the average cost of going to college from between now and 40 years ago is increased by nearly 200%. It's a huge jump, and the colleges are reaping the rewards of this. Meanwhile, making us feel like the athletes are greedy, right? When it's really, I always find the interesting dynamic when we get mad at the person that's closer to our level as opposed to getting mad at the person at the very top, which is just kind of like a weird microcosm of our society. So, where's this all headed, right? Where are we going with college football? Should you continue to watch college football? I think you should. It's a fun product. It's a great product. I was watching Washington and Weber State last night. It was entertaining, even though it was generally a blowout. The action's good. The athletes are tremendous. It's a incredibly watchable product. I do think that we're heading more and more towards of the professionalization of this entity. That maybe we need to view it in that lens as opposed to a school pride type situation. And I think that in the process, college football has lost a little bit of its unique character and identity. Has lost the regionalization aspect, has lost the pipelining that used to come in recruiting, right? And it's become more of a frenzy, a buyer's market, so to speak. And I think that that turnover can be exciting, right? There are a bunch of great websites and podcasts and YouTube channels that are dedicated to tracking the transfer portal, and those people do great jobs. But I do miss, the ability for a player to level up and grow in 2, 3 years at a school and then be ready for the NFL. I understand that the opposite of that is that players are being mistreated for many years. And I just find myself in a weird position because I'm always going to be on a player's side when it comes to getting paid and the whole amateurism idea, which has always been a farce to me. But at the same time, there was something that was a little magical about Saturdays, and I feel like maybe we're losing that a little bit with the injection of money and rapid player movement and coaches being fired quickly and all that. So I'm still going to be watching college football. I still am fascinated by the product, and I think that we're in for a great season with an expanded playoff that should make it even more exciting, more so than it's ever been. But would love to hear your thoughts on the state of college football. If you're listening on Spotify or on YouTube, please leave a comment. But this is going to wrap up another edition of the Deep Cover podcast. You can make sure to check out all the articles on deepcoversports.com and on offtheballnetwork.com. Make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Until next week, I'm your host, Omar Zaran, and I'll see you next time on the Deep Cover podcast.